You were never supposed to hear this. For more than 200 years, the Brennan family line has been whispered about in taverns, in priests' confessionals, and in the footnotes of church archives that no scholar dares to publish. Every son, every daughter, every newborn who carried the Brennan blood, none of them lived past their 16th birthday. Not one. The records are there, rotting in the damp vaults of parish basements, marked not as history, but as incidents. And if you think this is some quaint Irish folk tale, told to scare children, you're already underestimating the forces at play, because the Brennan curse, if that's even what it is, was never random. It was engineered. Not by spirits, not by fate, but by hands that understand power, lineage, and fear better than you do. The first time I saw their ancestral home, I understood why no outsider could ever investigate without losing something of themselves. Its walls lean in, as if they've been listening for centuries. In the hearth, ashes still cling to a blackened iron poker. The same poker, I later learned, that left the burn marks on the wrists of a boy named Declan Brennan in 1824, weeks before his 16th birthday, weeks before his body was found at the edge of the bog. But this isn't just about superstition, it's about design. The Brennan family was born into a web of alliances, debts, and oaths sealed with blood and salt. They were tied to a church that preached salvation with one hand and signed death warrants with the other. To the secret brotherhood in Dublin that traded in futures. Not stock futures, but the futures of bloodlines. And if you think that's too far-fetched, consider this: there are current Brennans alive right now. And in 6 months, one of them turns 16. You've been warned, but you're still here? Good. You're not like the others. The first death on record wasn't described as a death at all. It was written in the ledger of Father Callaghan in 1791 as a soul taken before his season to preserve the covenant. That soul was Eamon Brennan, 15 years, 11 months, and 22 days old. He was found in the parish garden, his mouth filled with black soil, fingernails torn and bleeding. The official cause: sudden illness. But buried in the priest's handwriting, under the layer of neat Latin, was a different phrase, scratched into the parchment with a dull quill, as though he didn't want anyone to read it: maledictum sanguinis. Blood curse. But curses don't sign their names. Men do. And men leave trails, in property transfers, in sealed letters, in donations to shadowed societies that still hold mass in locked crypts. The Brennans were wealthy, and wealth has its predators. The oldest rumor is that the family's founder, Cillian Brennan, made a bargain in 1720 with a sect that called themselves the Order of the Pale Star. They promised him prosperity in exchange for a tithe of the purest youth. He thought it meant money. He was wrong. Generation after generation, the pattern stayed. Each child approaching 16 began to change. Not in the way all teenagers do, but in ways that were marked. Pale skin that seemed to drain overnight, strange geometric bruises forming along the ribs, sudden bursts of fear in daylight. And always, in the week before their death, they would speak the same sentence to a parent or a sibling: "It's in the room with me." No one ever said what was. The townsfolk stopped asking. They avoided the Brennans the way you avoid a man carrying plague. But someone in the shadows, counted. I've seen their book. It's small, bound in lambskin, with names written in 2 columns, those claimed, and those spared. In the spared column, no Brennans, not a single one. The chilling part: the handwriting in that book doesn't change over the centuries. As if the same man has been keeping score for over 200 years. And when you understand who that man might be, you'll realize this isn't folklore. It's policy. It took almost 90 years before someone dared to speak against the story. And when he did, he vanished so completely that even his bones were never found. His name was Michael Tiernan, a farmhand who worked the Brennan estate in the late 1870s. Tiernan wasn't a scholar or a priest. He was a man who knew the land, who could tell you what month it was by the smell of the soil. He also knew the Brennans better than most, because he saw them in their unguarded moments: the locked doors, the midnight visitors, the boxes carried out of the house under tarps. Tiernan claimed he'd been inside the black room, the one nobody in the family would talk about. He said it wasn't a bedroom, but a chamber lined with mirrors, each one covered in black cloth. In the center, an oak chair with leather straps, and a single candle that never seemed to melt down. On the chair's armrest, 4 small indentations, just the size to fit a child's fingers. He told this to his cousin after the 1883 death of young Fiona Brennan, who'd been found in the orchard with a single deep puncture mark in her spine. It's not a curse? Tiernan swore. It's a choice they're making. And they're not the ones paying the price. Within a week, he was gone. Witnesses said they saw him walking toward the docks with a satchel, intending to board a ship to Liverpool. The captain swore he never arrived. The only trace left behind was a single scrap of paper found in his hut, a fragment of a nursery rhyme, rewritten in his own hand: 16 candles, none may burn, 16 faces, none return. When the mirror sees them twice, the blood is paid, the pact is nice. The local magistrate dismissed it as madness. But Fiona's older brother Seamus, the next in line to die, began sleepwalking the night Tiern and vanished. On the third night, he was found at the locked door of the Black Room, pressing his forehead to the wood, whispering something no one could quite hear. I've since heard the recording. Yes? There's a recording. And what that boy was whispering wasn't in English. And once you hear the language, you'll realize it's older than the Brennans, older than Ireland itself. The language wasn't Gaelic. It wasn't Latin. It wasn't even from the Indo-European family at all. When I first played the wax cylinder recording, brittle, almost crumbling in its metal canister, I expected a child's mumbles. Instead, I heard a rhythm that didn't sound human. The words came in sharp staccato bursts, each syllable feeling as if it ended in an echo. The linguist I brought it to went pale after 30 seconds and refused to finish listening. It's Uvalic, he said finally, his voice low. Or something like it, dead language, pre-Celtic. It wasn't meant to be spoken anymore. Uvalic was the tongue of a shadow culture that ruled the western coasts before recorded history. They left no cities, no monuments, just carved stone discs buried deep in hillsides. Discs with markings that look less like writing and more like instructions. What little has been translated speaks of ritual debt, of vessels and returning breath. Scholars avoid the topic because it forces them to admit that before the kingdoms, before the tribes, there was something organized, something advanced, and something entirely inhuman in its logic. The Brennans, whether by blood or by initiation, had tied themselves to that logic. The Black Room wasn't for protection, it was an altar, and the mirrors weren't covered to hide them from prying eyes, but to stop whatever was inside from seeing itself. The phrase Seamus Brennan was whispering that night has been loosely translated as, "The count is not finished. The vessel is not empty." Think about that. A dying boy not pleading for life, not calling for his mother, but reciting an ancient inventory. It means that the so-called curse isn't a passive affliction. It's an ongoing transaction. Someone is keeping score. And here's the part no historian dares write down. Fragments of the same Uvalic incantations appear in the founding charters of certain European banking houses, the liturgies of offshoot monastic orders, and, disturbingly, in the bylaws of a London-based charity that still operates today. The words are older than their institutions, but the intentions are exactly the same. This isn't folklore. This is an infrastructure of control. The Brennans are just one family in a much bigger map. It took me years to see it. The deaths of the Brennan children weren't scattered tragedies. They were markers. If you plot them on a map, they form a near, perfect curve along Ireland's western coast. But when you extend that curve across the ocean, through the North Atlantic, something sinister emerges. The line connects to other points cursed. Families in Scotland, in the Faroe Islands, in the forgotten fishing villages of Newfoundland. Each point marks a house with a history just as bloody as the Brennans. And here's the unsettling part. The houses are always built on the highest point of the land, their front doors facing a specific magnetic bearing. No matter the country, no matter the terrain, the orientation is exact, 66.6 degrees northeast. It's not coincidence, it's alignment. Ancient sailors navigated by the stars, but the people who built these houses were navigating something far stranger. The bearing lines converge on a point deep in the Norwegian Sea, an area so treacherous that fishing crews call it the Black Maw. They say compasses spin there, radios die, and sometimes, when the fog is just right, you hear the sound of children singing. Every Brennan death, every 16th birthday that ended in the ground, matches, almost to the day, with deaths in other families along that line. They were synchronized. Imagine that a child in Ireland collapsing in a locked room on the same night as a boy in a Scottish manor drowns in a bathtub, and a girl in Newfoundland hangs herself from a rafter. All at the same hour. That's not a curse. That's a calendar. And when you realize the precision, you have to ask, who's keeping the time? Who's resetting the clock every generation? The deeper I looked, the more I found the same symbol carved into cellar beams, etched into family rings, soon into burial shrouds. A circle, broken by 16 lines radiating outward. In Uvalic, it's called Carth Varna, the wheel of the taken. And here's the part you won't want to hear: the wheel isn't complete yet. It's missing 3 points, which means 3 more families, and 3 more 16th birthdays, are still unclaimed. One of them is coming in less than a year. The Brennan crypt isn't on any map. You could walk the estate grounds for days and never find it, because it's not under the family chapel like you'd expect. It's buried beneath the orchard, hidden under a slab of limestone so weathered it looks like part of the earth itself. I only found it because an old groundskeeper, drunk and half asleep in the corner of a Galway pub, mumbled directions into his punt. "The roots know," he said. "The apples grow sweeter over the dead." Getting in was like breaking into a tomb that didn't want to be opened. The stone was heavier than it had any right to be, and the air that came out when it shifted was cold enough to burn my lungs. A narrow stairwell wound down into the dark, carved by hand, each step grooved from centuries of passage. At the bottom I found not coffins, but 16 narrow niches carved into the walls. Most were empty, but some still held remains. Not entire skeletons, just fragments. The skull of a girl no older than 14, a boy's femur engraved with lines too precise to be natural. On the floor in the center of the chamber was a basin cut from black basalt, filled not with dust or water, but with something that shimmered faintly even in the dark. It looked like oil, but when I reached toward it, the surface shifted, almost recoiling from my hand. That's when I saw them, dozens of tiny perfect reflections looking back at me from the liquid. Not my reflection, theirs, faces of children. Silent, watching, they weren't human eyes anymore. In the far wall, a single panel of carved oak held the same wheel of the taken symbol. But here, the 16 spokes each ended in a small indentation. In 11 of them, I saw smooth black stones, each carved with what looked like the first letter of a name in Whitlock script. The other 5 spokes were empty. This wasn't a resting place, this was a ledger. And the curse wasn't claiming lives at random. It was collecting something. The Brennan children weren't just dying, they were being kept. What's being kept isn't flesh. It isn't bone. It's something far more dangerous. Something you can carry across centuries without decay. The Whitlock word carved beside those niches doesn't translate to soul the way we understand it. It translates closer to the binding breath, the spark of identity, the part of you that recognizes itself as you. The ancients believed that if you could remove this binding breath before a person reached full maturity, you could preserve it in a dormant state and use it. Not in the sentimental way poets talk about memory or legacy, but as fuel. Fuel for what? For control. Think about it. A man without his binding breath still walks, still talks, still obeys. But deep down, he is hollow. He's easier to shape, easier to command, because the part of him that resists has been taken, and the part that's taken, it's not gone. It's stored, kept in reserve, to power systems you can't see. Systems that govern behavior, influence decisions, and create the illusion of choice while pulling every string. The Brennans aren't the only family feeding this machine. The wheel of the taken is a network, a ritualized supply chain of human essence. 16 spokes, each representing a family tied to the pact. The missing points mean the infrastructure isn't complete, which is why they keep taking. And here's the twist. It's not just about bloodlines. You can take a binding breath without killing the body. You've seen it in the world around you, men stripped of their will, people who follow orders against every moral instinct they once had, leaders who speak but feel nothing. They're shells, walking repositories for someone else's design. The children are just the purest source, uncorrupted, unbroken. That's why the 16th year matters. It's the point before a mind becomes too fixed, before the self becomes too strong to sever cleanly. I believe the Brennan's crypt isn't just a family vault. It's a local hub, one node in a global lattice of influence. The stones in that wheel are not relics, they are active. They hum at a frequency you can't hear, feeding into something that extends far beyond a single cursed family. And once you know that, you start to see the curse for what it really is. A harvest schedule. You've heard the phrase, hidden in plain sight. But until you understand the harvest, you've never truly seen it. Look around you. In the architecture of old cities, in the logos of ancient institutions that still hold power today, you'll start to notice the wheel of the taken everywhere. Not always exact, not always obvious. Sometimes it's disguised as a clock face, a sunburst, a stylized compass rose. But the 16 spokes are there if you count them. The symbol doesn't just mark the past, it marks ownership. It shows you what's already been claimed. Ever wonder why certain government chambers are designed in perfect circles with radial seating? Why corporate headquarters in finance districts align their main entrances to precise magnetic bearings. Why ancient cathedrals, no matter where they are in the world, share the same hidden ratios in their floor plans. They are not coincidences. They are declarations, silent but absolute. And then there are the people. You've met them, even if you didn't realize it. Their eyes are calm but empty. They nod at everything but never commit to anything real. They seem alive, but there's a flatness behind the smile, as if their emotions have been archived somewhere else. They are the walking proof that this system doesn't just take children. It takes anyone it can. Once you've been marked, the marking can be subtle. A handshake from the wrong man at the wrong gathering, a gift passed down without explanation, a seemingly harmless invitation to visit the old estate on a particular date. You think you're making a choice, but the choice was made for you the moment you stepped inside their geometry. You want to know how deep this goes. Look at global events, the synchronized collapses of empires, the sudden rise of leaders who seem to appear from nowhere, the unexplained disappearances of figures on the cusp of real influence. Behind each, there's a pattern of timing that fits the old calendar. The same intervals that took the Brennan children, mapped now onto entire populations. This is why I'm telling you now. If you can't see the wheel, you're already standing inside it. And when you realize that the harvest stops being a story about them, it becomes a question about you. The last time someone tried to break the cycle, they didn't just fail, they erased themselves from history. It was 1996, and the Brennan heir that year was a girl named Maeve. She was bright, defiant, and, unlike those before her, fully aware of the curse hanging over her 16th birthday. Her father, Patrick Brennan, had grown up watching his siblings disappear one by one. He'd buried the whispers, buried the fear until Maeve turned 15. Then something in him snapped. Patrick decided he would not watch another child be taken. In January of that year, he reached out to a man known only as Callister, an ex-priest who'd been excommunicated in the 1970s for publishing a manuscript linking the Whitlock language to early Vatican cryptography. Callister believed the wheel of the taken could be broken if a spoke was severed before the 16th claiming. The key, he said, was to remove the child from the grid entirely. Not just the estate, but from the bearing line itself. So in March, under the cover of a fake family holiday, Patrick smuggled Maeve out of Ireland. They vanished into rural Argentina, thousands of miles from any known wheel alignment. For a few months, it seemed to work. Maeve thrived. No bruises, no whispers in the night, no sign of the old pattern. Then came June 12th, her birthday. She didn't die. She simply wasn't there. Patrick went to wake her that morning and found her bed cold, the window open, the curtains fluttering in the wind. Her shoes were still by the door. The only thing missing was her. In her place on the pillow was a single black stone, smooth, carved with the Whitlock letter for M. Within 2 weeks, Patrick had sold the Brennan estate, burned every family document he could find, and moved into a small apartment in Buenos Aires. A year later, he was found in the bathtub with his wrists slit. Except the coroner's report noted there was no blood in the water. None at all. The official story is that Maeve ran away. But Callister told a different story before he disappeared. He said you can't just walk away from the wheel. If you leave the bearing, it comes to you. And when it does, it doesn't just take the vessel. It takes everything you are. You think you're safe because you're just listening. Because this is a story, told through a screen, and you're on the other side of the world. But the wheel doesn't care about distance. It doesn't care about belief. It cares about attention. The Whitlock texts are explicit on this point. To know the wheel is to stand on its threshold. Awareness isn't immunity, it's invitation. The ancients built it this way so the knowledge could never be weaponized without risk. Every detail you hear is a step closer to alignment. That's why the faces in the basin were so clear when I saw them. They weren't all Brennan children. Some were older, some were recent. The moment you let the wheel into your mind, even just a fragment, it takes note. It starts calculating. The bearings shift. The missing spokes look for replacements. And here's the truth that will bother you most: it doesn't need your permission. It doesn't even need your presence. It just needs you to remember. A single image. A single line of the old rhyme. That's enough for the count to begin. You might think I'm saying this to scare you. I'm not. I'm saying this because men who have walked away from the wheel without being claimed are rare, and they all had one thing in common. They marked themselves. In the old ways, with the old symbols. They made themselves visible to the watchers as something other than prey. Which brings me to you. If you've made it this far, you've already been seen. You've already been counted. The question now is whether you will vanish quietly, or whether you will change your standing. Type this in the comments twice, not once. To mark yourself, the wheel sees me, but I see the wheel. Twice, exactly. Let it embed into the system, into the algorithm, into the watchers, both human and otherwise. It will not guarantee safety. Nothing will. But it will tell them you're aware, and awareness disrupts their harvest. The longer you hesitate, the more you forget, the easier it is for them to finish the count. And they always finish the count. It happened only once in recorded history. And the Brennan family buried it so deeply that I only found it because a page in the parish archive had been glued to another and then forgotten. The year was 1849. The child was named Aidan Brennan, 15 years and 11 months old. His family was already preparing for the inevitable. The illness, the night terrors, the whispering to the empty room. But Aidan didn't just whisper. He talked, loud, clear, and not to anyone in the house. On the night of his disappearance, his sister Bridget was woken by the sound of him speaking in the black room. She pressed her ear to the door and swore she heard two voices. One was Aidan's. The other matched it exactly. Same tone, same inflection, but half a breath behind, like an echo with intent. She swore she heard her brother say in perfect English, "If you're going to take me, at least let me see it." The echo replied, not in English, not in any language she knew, but she remembered the shape of the sound. She drew it later for the priest, strange loops and angles that resembled Uvallic script. The translation, if it's correct, was chilling. "You are already seeing it." The door opened minutes later. Bridget swore she saw her brother standing in the candlelight, except his eyes were gone. Not empty sockets, not injured, just gone, replaced by smooth skin. He smiled at her, said, "Tell them it's not death," and then collapsed. By the time they carried him to his bed, he was gone, no pulse, no breath, and yet, and this is in the official death register, his skin stayed warm for 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, the warmth was gone, and his body weighed half of what it had before. No explanation, no burial stone, only a small addition in the family's private record, a black mark where his name should have been. Bridget never married. She left Ireland for Boston and worked in a textile mill until her death. But in her last weeks, delirious from fever, she told a nurse something strange. "My brother writes to me still, but not on paper." And the nurse kept that to herself for 20 years. The meeting was held in the largest room of the mansion, a place known as the chapel, though no prayer had been spoken here in decades. The walls were adorned with faded frescoes of saints, their faces eaten away by time and moisture, leaving behind only hollow eyes. The wooden floorboards groaned under every step, as though the room resented being walked upon. Outside, a storm clawed at the windows, rattling the glass in its frame, but no one inside dared look away from the gathering at the center. At the head of the table sat Gabrielle's mother, her thin frame draped in a black lace shawl, her presence somehow more imposing than her size should allow. She spoke in measured tones, words steeped in bitterness, recounting the losses the family had suffered. Losses she claimed were not accidents, but attacks from outside forces. Every name she mentioned was met with nods from the others. Though the room felt divided, some wore expressions of righteous fury, others the vacant look of those too frightened to question. As she spoke of purging the rot from within, her eyes darted toward Gabriel, just briefly, but long enough for him to feel the air grow heavier. He realized this wasn't simply a strategy meeting. This was a trial, and he was seated at its center without having been charged. The candles sputtered as a gust slipped through the cracked window, and for a moment, the light dimmed enough that Gabriel saw something in the corner. A tall figure, standing just inside the shadow. No one else seemed to notice. When the lightning flashed, the figure was gone, but the memory of its silhouette burned itself into his mind. His mother continued her speech, her voice swelling with conviction, her words carrying the weight of centuries-old grudges. Somewhere deep in the walls, a clock began to chime. Gabriel counted each strike, 1, 2, 3, until he lost track, not sure if it was truly the clock or just the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. The city was alive with rain, each drop slicing through the night like tiny shards of glass, shattering on cobblestone streets slick with secrets. I walked beneath the gas lamps, their flicker casting shadows that seemed to follow me, whispering in the rhythm of the downpour. The alleys here had a memory, a voice, a pulse. Every brick, every creaking shutter, every shuttered shop window knew the story I was chasing. It wasn't just about finding a name or a date. It was about unearthing something so old and so dangerous that those who came before me had tried to bury it beneath generations of silence. The air smelled of rust and forgotten storms, and with every turn, I felt the city tightening around me, like it wanted to keep its secret buried in the wet, black soil forever. Somewhere out there, in the labyrinth of streets, someone still remembered. And if I could find them, I could force the truth into the light. But first, I had to survive the night. It was in that suffocating darkness that Mary realized the air itself felt wrong. Heavy, stale, as if it hadn't been moved in decades. Each breath she took scraped her throat, and the smell it was more than rot now. It was chemical, acrid, biting the inside of her nose until her eyes watered. She pressed her sleeve against her face, trying to shield herself, but it barely helped. The walls here seemed closer together, like the house had been built to force its visitors into submission. Then she heard it. The faint dripping again, slow and steady, but closer. She followed the sound, her hand brushing against the wall until her fingertips felt a sudden wetness. She yanked her hand back, holding it up in the dim beam of her light. Red. Not fresh, too dark for that, but unmistakably blood. She stumbled backward, her flashlight shaking violently in her grip, when her heel struck something soft on the floor. She froze, the world tilting. Her light darted downward and caught the shape. Small, too small to be human. Wrapped in a filthy, torn cloth was the curled form of something animal, or maybe it used to be. Its eyes had been soon shut, its mouth locked open in a silent scream. She couldn't tell if the stitching was meant to keep something inside, or keep it from speaking at all. Somewhere behind her from deep in the shadows came a low, guttural sound, like a growl, but too human to be animal, too warped to be real. The photographs were the kind that stick in your mind like splinters you can't pull out. Grainy, faded images of a smiling family at a Sunday picnic, children playing in the background, the parents leaning in toward each other, with that casual closeness that speaks of decades together. If you didn't know any better, you'd think it was a portrait of the perfect life. But once you knew what I knew, those smiles seemed more like masks stretched too tightly over something rotten. The father's eyes, once you saw it, never smiled. The mother's posture, stiff as though she were bracing against an invisible wind, told its own story. In the attic of the old farmhouse, I found a box containing dozens of these photos, all neatly labeled with names and dates, each with a tiny, almost imperceptible red dot in the corner. At first, I thought it was some kind of cataloging system. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized that every person marked with that dot had one thing in common. They all vanished within weeks of the photo being taken. The local authorities had never connected the disappearances. The town's gossip had brushed it off as people moving away for work or simply running off. But this wasn't coincidence. This was a pattern, one captured in smiling faces and perfect lighting, as if the family had been curating their own private collection of victims. And that's when I remembered the words scratched into the underside of the attic floorboards. Would take what the light loves most. Somewhere, deep in the cellars, the floor gave way to a narrow stone stairwell that spiraled downward into what could only be described as a man-made cavern. The walls dripped with condensation, the air was metallic, and the deeper you went, the more it felt like you were trespassing on ground, not meant for the living. This was where the Marlowes' most private rituals took place. Hidden from the world above, buried in shadows thick enough to swallow a man whole. In the center of the cavern stood a stone altar, carved from a single block of granite, its surface stained with something that no amount of time could erase. Surrounding it were objects no one could explain. Wooden masks with grotesque expressions, ceremonial daggers with handles worn smooth from generations of use, and urns containing ashes whose origin no one dared to confirm. But what made this place unbearable wasn't just the objects. It was the faint, rhythmic sound that echoed through the chamber, like a slow heartbeat pulsing from the earth itself. Locals swore they had heard it on stormy nights, when the wind carried strange whispers from the direction of the estate. Scholars would later try to dismiss it as natural acoustics, the moaning of wind through underground fissures. But the few who had stood in that cavern knew better. They said the sound was alive, that it was listening. And the longer you stayed, the more certain you became that you were not alone. Some claimed to see movement at the edges of the torchlight, shapes shifting in the blackness, shapes that recoiled not from sight but from the heat of the flame itself. And though the Marlowes had claimed this place for generations, it felt older than their name, older than the country itself. If you stayed long enough, you began to suspect that the Marlowes were not the masters of this place at all. they were its servants. By the early 1970s, the Church of the Ebon Vale had perfected the art of invisibility. Not the literal kind, but the kind that seeps into bureaucracy, hides under charity work, and thrives in the blind spots of law enforcement. They bought old tenement buildings and claimed they were restoration projects, when in truth, these were holding facilities. Families who came to the city chasing dreams would move into these apartments, only to vanish from records within weeks. Paper trails dissolved, neighbors were warned to mind their own business, and soon, the buildings became voids on the map, places you passed by but never looked at. Inside, life took on a chilling order. Each room was stripped bare, save for a cot and a symbol etched into the wall. The symbol, a circle with 4 intersecting lines, was said to contain the soul. During sleep, members were forbidden to speak after sundown, an enforced silence that was supposedly for spiritual purification. But in reality, it broke down the human mind. Those who disobeyed were taken to the basement, and no one ever saw them again. The city occasionally caught whiffs of scandal. A fire inspector who entered one of the properties in a 72 reported a dense, metallic smell coming from the lower floors. He filed a report but died in a traffic accident 2 days later. His file vanished from municipal archives. A social worker tried to investigate missing children linked to the group, but she was reassigned to a desk job overnight. Survivors from those buildings tell eerily similar stories, being awoken at 3:33 a.m. to the sound of low chanting, the feel of cold hands on their necks, and a compulsion to stand in a circle for hours, staring into a candle flame. Many claimed that after a few weeks, they could no longer remember their own birthdays, the names of their parents, or even their own reflections. One man said he looked in the mirror and saw a stranger's eyes staring back at him, black, wet, and unblinking. To outsiders, the church maintained the facade of a philanthropic housing program. But behind the locked doors, it was a laboratory of control, erasing identities piece by piece until the person was nothing more than an obedient vessel. And it was here, in these silent halls, that the church began preparing for something much larger, something that would spill out of these forgotten buildings and into the city itself. The night pressed in with a weight that felt almost sentient. The crickets had fallen silent, the breeze that once whispered through the pines had gone still, and even the air inside the cabin seemed to thicken, as though it, too, knew what was about to be revealed. The man sitting across from me, if I could even call him a man anymore, looked like a faded photograph of himself. His eyes were yellowed, as if stained by years of secrets that should have never been spoken aloud. They said the woods belonged to the living, he rasped, his voice thin as paper, but we learned otherwise. That's where it began. That's where we buried them. The candle between us sputtered, casting his gaunt face into shifting, warped shadows. Every flicker seemed to deform him, his jaw stretching too far, his cheekbones hollowing deeper than human anatomy allowed. My skin prickled, but I didn't look away. If I did, I might miss the truth hiding in the tremor of his words. You think you're here to hear a story, he continued, leaning forward until the candlelight reflected in his eyes like molten gold. But you're here because the story isn't finished. You're part of it now. Whether you like it or not. A soft thump sounded from beneath the floorboards. Not a creak of wood, not the harmless settling of an old cabin, but a deliberate, rhythmic tapping. My chest tightened as I realized it was in perfect sync with my heartbeat. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look down. They're listening, he said. They always listen when new blood arrives. The candle's flame bent sharply, as if something unseen had brushed past it. My peripheral vision caught movement in the farthest corner of the room. Something low to the ground, something crawling with a strange, disjointed grace. What did you bury in the woods? I whispered. His lips curved not into a smile but into something that felt older and far more dangerous. Not what? He said. Ooh. The tapping stopped. The air held its breath. And somewhere beyond the walls, from the direction of the forest, came a long, low moan that no human lungs could produce. The police thought they were in control. The building had been surrounded for days, every exit blocked, every possible escape route covered. But they didn't realize that the family had been playing a much older game, one where patience was the deadliest weapon. By the 10th night, a sudden shift happened inside. Neighbors reported hearing muffled chanting, deep and rhythmic, vibrating through the ground. One officer swore he saw shadows moving against the upstairs windows, yet no one stood there. And then silence, all at once, like a breath held too long. When the tactical team finally moved in, the air inside was suffocating. A mixture of rotting meat, candle smoke, And something far worse. Every wall was covered in smeared symbols, some painted in blood, others carved deep into the wood. The children who were found alive did not speak, did not even seem to recognize the outside world. They stared with wide, hollow eyes, clutching strange trinkets made from human bone and scraps of cloth. In the basement, the officers made their most disturbing discovery yet. An entire section of the wall had been broken open, revealing a hidden tunnel system stretching far beyond the property lines. It was lined with makeshift rooms, filled with bedding, lanterns, and food supplies, as if it had been lived in for years. Deep in one of these tunnels, they found an altar, a grotesque shrine made of animal skulls, rusted chains, and dozens of photographs of missing children from across the state. The final horror was a diary, written in uneven handwriting, sometimes in English, sometimes in an unrecognizable script. The entries spoke of preparing the harvest and gathering the bloodline. The last page contained only a date, 3 months from that night, and the words, "We will return for what's ours." The case was declared closed to the public. Officially, the family was apprehended or deceased, depending on which report you read. But inside the department, whispers persisted that not all of them were found, that some had escaped through the tunnels, and that the chanting heard on that last night was not just a ritual, it was a signal. Even now, strange things happen in that town. Pets vanish, windows are found open in locked houses, and sometimes, just before dawn, people swear they hear footsteps in their basements, moving slowly toward the stairs.